So, I'm not sure how to go about this exactly. Trying to talk about Vampirella can be so contentious because of, well, obvious reasons. But Vampirella is so much more than her iconic, and salacious to some, outfit. In some ways, Vampirella was also a rebellion against the censorship of the comics code, against the traditional view of what a vampire could be, and against prudishness. But, we also need to look at things through a more modern lens. While the costume was created by a woman who was a feminist, essentially giving the middle finger to both the established norms and the view of what a woman could wear, well, nowadays, I asked almost every woman I know what they thought about this outfit, and all of them have stopped speaking to me, including my mother. The outfit just makes it impossible for anyone new to Vampirella to take her seriously as a character, because she looks like she was created to cater to the male gaze, despite that not being the case, and instead was created with the opposite intent. And I can't blame anyone who feels that way, especially considering the history of female comic book characters being used as cheesecake, which Vampirella has helped to cater to at some points in her career. In fact, I avoided reading Vampirella stories because I felt they were just cheesecake pandering to men who had a sexy vampire fetish. Well, they weren't intended as such, and the fact that Vampy was printed at a time when the comics code wielded the greatest level of influence it ever had makes her quite admirable. Okay, so I need to provide some context regarding the comics code, especially how it came about and its impact on the industry. So, after World War II, superheroes dropped in popularity and horror and crime became the main genres featured in comics. Frederick Wortham, a psychiatrist, would publish a book called Seduction of the Innocent about how these comics were harmful to kids. As a doctor said these things in public, naturally it didn't take long for the pearl clutching and the finger wagging to begin. To save themselves, the comic book companies would band together to write a comics code of self-censorship, which is often blamed for stunting the growth of the medium at a time when it was yet to truly discover itself. Additionally, if one were of a conspiratorial mindset, some restrictions placed on horror comics seem to be aimed at killing the genre by rival publications. Not naming names, but it does feel like one hell of a coincidence that soon after the code's implementation, we got a superhero resurgence leading into the Silver Age. So I guess the question is, how can a comic like Vampirella with a female lead who could be generally described as voluptuous and seductive, wearing a salacious outfit and starring in a horror setting, be made during this time? Well, that's just it. The comics code could only apply to comic books. If Vampirella was published as, say, a black and white magazine in a completely different format, the code just didn't apply to it. Legal loopholes. Sometimes they work in the creator's favor. Besides Trina Robbins, Vampirella was also created by sci-fi writer Forrest J. Ackerman, and it was perhaps his influence that led to Vampy having an unorthodox origin story for a vampire. She was originally from the planet of Draculon, where water had been replaced by blood and caused all the inhabitants of the planet to rely on it to survive. Eventually, Vampy would end up on Earth, where she became a key player in the fight against the forces of chaos. Yes, that's chaos with a capital C. I admire the original origin for Vampirella for not going the traditional route with vampire fiction. After all, why couldn't there be a planet of creatures who just happen to resemble vampires? This gave Vampirella's early stories a bit of a sci-fi edge, even though once on Earth, most of her stuff did end up dealing with traditional horror-based threats. Vampirella was published as a magazine by Warren Publishing for 112 issues until they went bankrupt in 1983. After that, the rights to Vampirella ended up in the hands of a company called Harris Publications Inc., who published her adventures for around 2 years. This era is probably the ones fans remember the most, and sadly it's for all the wrong reasons. Not only did Vampirella's origins get retconned into her being the daughter of Lilith, a more traditional vampire origin as opposed to the sci-fi one she originally had, her costume started to shrink further and further to the point she became just another female lead meant to titillate the audience. It's not surprising that during this time she would take part in several crossovers with similar titles like Witchblade, Magdalena, and Lady Death. Eventually, Vampirella would end up at Dynamite Entertainment, where she continues to remain to this day. While this should have provided her stability, that ended up not being the case. She's had 7 ongoing series, 14 limited series, 12 one-shots, 17 crossovers, and 6 spin-offs. And I know there are still some of you who think that means Vampirella must now be a pillar of Dynamite Entertainment. Well, let me shatter that illusion for you. Not only have none of the ongoing series lasted for 40 issues at least, but each writer coming in decides to alter Vampy's continuity even further. Some of them will ignore what the previous creative team did and make sweeping changes, but those changes will last as long as the current writer is on board, and soon a new writer will dump a bunch of other ideas and concepts on Vampirella. How bad did this get? Well, at this point, somehow both her origins are canon. Her main love interest, Adam, has died and been reborn so many times you'd think he was from DC or Marvel. And the character Pendragon, who was a simple stage magician with a drinking problem who was nevertheless one of her closest allies, is basically the Doctor Strange of the universe at this point. So yes, trying to pick up a random Vampirella comic will be confusing to any new reader, as her history is so random, it is meaningless to parse it at this point. My personal recommendation is for interested readers to try out the original Warren publications. Dynamite has actually republished those, so finding them shouldn't be an issue, as they're probably Vampirella at her purest. But yeah, I think it's pretty clear at this point why Vampirella needs her original costume. It's the only unique thing about her. Whether or not you can get past that is up to you.